Please, I am begging you, untie it." The rancher froze when he saw the obese woman tied to a fence. Her dress was torn, her wrists raw, and her eyes held the kind of fear a man don't forget easy. She wasn't from town. No one knew her name. But someone had left her out there like an animal, to suffer, to be seen. The wind carried no mercy that day. He'd come for cattle. He found something else, something awful, something that would burn through every man's soul if they had one left to burn. Who would do such a thing? And why did the woman keep whispering, "It's not me they want," as if the devil himself was still out there? This ain't a story about justice coming clean. It's about what happens when a man stops looking the other way and starts digging into the dirt. When a cry for help echoes across the prairie and a secret waits behind every broken fence post, one question lingers. Who left her there? And who will carry the truth when the dust finally settles? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories like these still reach across counties, states, and hearts. If you believe in justice, redemption, and the quiet strength of doing what's right, then you're already part of this journey. Let me know which state you're watching from and subscribe to help us keep bringing these stories to life. The sun had just begun to lean westward when Eli Whitlow spotted something out by the north pasture fence, a dark blotch that didn't match the land. His cattle had drifted off to the creek bed, the wind was still, and the air felt heavy in his chest, as if something long buried had stirred beneath the soil. He rode closer, squinting. At first he thought it was a scarecrow, some fool prankster's doing, left behind by drifters. But then he saw the skirt flapping against thick ankles, the torn sleeves exposing swollen arms, the rise and fall of a chest heaving slow, labored breaths. She was tied to the fence. Her wrists were raw, bound with old hemp rope. Sunburn blistered her cheeks, and dried blood crusted beneath her nostrils. Her body slumped against the post, like she'd lost the will to hold it upright. Dirt caked her bare feet. One eye was swollen shut, and yet her mouth moved, just barely, a whisper, repeating over and over. "Please, I am begging you, untie it." Eli dismounted slowly, one hand still near the rifle on his saddle. He didn't recognize her. She was heavy-set, unfamiliar, and something about the whole scene rang wrong. Not random, not by accident. He looked up and down the fence line. No tracks, no horse prints, no wagon grooves. Just her. Just him. Just the wind beginning to pick up. He stood over her for a long minute. Her lips moved again. The same plea. The words weren't meant for him. They were memories, fragments. He stepped forward and crouched. Her eye fluttered open, and for a heartbeat she saw him, but her face contorted with panic. Her voice was hoarse, near gone, but she rasped, "Don't let them find me." Eli pulled his knife and cut the rope. It had been tied with expert knots, ritual knots almost, not a rancher's hand, not meant to hold cattle, but something else, something cruel. When the last strand gave, her body collapsed into the dirt with a grunt. She didn't cry. She didn't move. He stared down at her and felt the hollow ache in his ribs that he hadn't let himself feel in years. She was hurt, lost, and terrified. And for reasons he couldn't name, he couldn't leave her there. He lifted her, heavy as she was, and settled her on the horse's back, strapping her in with care. Her head lolled to the side, but she didn't fight him. She simply breathed, slow and shallow, like someone expecting to die, and not quite ready to believe she hadn't. By the time they reached the edge of his property, the sky was copper and lavender. The mountains cast long shadows that stretched like fingers across the land. Eli's cabin stood small beneath the pines, untouched by the world, untouched by anything, for years. He brought her inside, laid her on the cot by the fire, and lit the stove. Her breathing stayed uneven. Her face was pale, sweat beading at her temple. She murmured again, almost inaudibly, "Hide me, please, hide me." Eli stared at the closed door. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. He only felt the same question crawling up his spine like frost. What kind of evil ties a woman to a fence in the middle of nowhere and walks away? As the moon rose, he boarded up the windows and loaded his rifle. He hadn't done either in years, not since the fire. But something told him the past wasn't done with him yet. The cabin was quiet except for the creak of old wood settling and the faint hiss of wind pushing against the boarded windows. Eli sat at the table sharpening his knife, each drag of the blade against the stone, a steady rhythm that calmed his thoughts. On the cot near the hearth, the woman stirred beneath the quilt he'd thrown over her. Her breath came ragged, as if every inhale still carried the weight of rope around her chest. She shifted once, twice, and then her eyes cracked open, red-rimmed and wet but steady enough to meet his for a flicker of a moment. When she spoke, her voice was dry and broken, as though it had traveled across deserts to reach him. "Dinah," she whispered, almost like a question. "My name is Dinah." Eli nodded but didn't speak. He poured a cup of water and handed it to her. She clutched it with trembling hands and drank greedily, water running down her chin, staining the quilt. He could see the bruises more clearly now in the firelight, rings around her wrists, a welt across her cheek, the kind of injuries left by hands that didn't care if they killed or not. She didn't look at him again after drinking. She stared instead at the wooden planks of the cabin ceiling, as though memorizing an escape route. "Where are you from, Dinah?" Eli asked quietly. Her lips pressed together. She shook her head. "I can't say. They'll come." "They?" Her body went stiff. The cup clattered from her hands to the floor. She drew the quilt up to her chin and began to rock, muttering words that sounded like prayers. "Don't make me go back. Don't let them find me." Eli held up his hands, palms out, the knife long forgotten. "No one's taken you anywhere tonight. You're safe here." She didn't answer. She just stared at the flames like a woman staring into the past. Eli leaned back in his chair, watching her. His mind began to piece together possibilities. A husband with a temper, a gang that used women like mules, or a religious sect like the ones he'd heard whispers about near the border. Whoever she was running from, it wasn't some random drifter. There was weight in her terror, a shape behind it she refused to name. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves on hard dirt, distant, heading toward town. Eli glanced at the chimney smoke curling into the evening sky. In that town, gossip was faster than a telegraph. They'd see the smoke and remember the last time his cabin had a guest before the fire. They'd remember the wife and the child and the whispers of his temper. They'd make their stories, call him a hermit hiding something. Maybe they'd come to see for themselves. Dinah lay back down and turned her face to the wall, still whispering something he couldn't hear. Eli set his jaw. Whatever had happened to her, she wasn't just passing through. She'd been left out there like a message, and whether he wanted it or not, that message was now tied to him. The morning sun leaked in slits through the cracks in the boarded windows, casting narrow lines across the warped floorboards of the cabin. Dust floated in the beams, stirred by no wind, only the memory of one. The place smelled of old wood, ash, and time. Eli moved about in silence, as he always had, each step across the uneven floor mapped by years of repetition. He fetched water from the barrel, poured a ladleful into the basin, and placed it beside the cot where Dinah still lay, her breath slow but steady. She hadn't spoken since the day before, just nodded faintly when he brought her food and water, then turned her eyes away again. But she was watching, even when he thought she wasn't. He could feel it, the way her gaze lingered on the corners of the room, on the spaces that were full of something more than air. The cabin bore marks of a life stopped mid-sentence. Above the hearth, a faded lace wedding dress hung on a nail, its fabric yellowed, untouched. A child's wooden toy horse sat on a shelf, a wheel missing. One rocking chair faced the window, worn soft by hands long gone. Dinah didn't comment. She didn't need to. Her silence made it clear she saw everything. She saw the ghosts. Eli didn't talk much, hadn't in years, but he caught himself mumbling as he stirred the pot on the stove, a habit born of long days spent alone. "Don't burn the beans this time," he muttered, then looked up, realizing he'd spoken as if to someone else. Dinah was still. Her eyes were closed, but her lips twitched, not in a smile, but in some quiet understanding. She never asked about the dress, never asked who he talked to, never asked about the framed sketch of a woman and child beside the fire, its glass cracked and blackened at the edges. In her silence, there was no judgment, and somehow that stung more than words might have. That night, after the fire dimmed to coals, Eli drifted into uneasy sleep in the corner cot. Dinah's breathing was rhythmic, but around midnight it changed. She whimpered first, then gasped, and then screamed. Eli shot upright as her cries filled the room. "Don't untie it! Don't untie it! Please! It's not ready! It's not ready!" He stumbled across the room to her side. Her eyes were open but wild, unseeing. Her fists clenched the blanket like it could save her. "It's all right," he said, trying not to sound panicked. "You're not there. You're here. You're safe." But she didn't hear him. Her voice dropped into low moans, repeating the same two words. "Not ready." Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She sank back, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Eli stood over her, breath shallow. Not ready for what? He didn't know what haunted her dreams, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of those woods. Something unseen. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode the fence line. He walked the full stretch, eyes sweeping the tall grass, the tree line, the path to town. Nothing was out there. No tracks, no sign. Still, every morning after that, he checked the fence. Every post, every wire, just in case something or someone had come looking. The town of Fairvale had long ago learned to speak in whispers when the name Eli Whitlow came up. Folks remembered smoke curling up from the pine-covered ridge nearly 8 years past, the night the Whitlow place burned and took his wife and child with it. What followed was silence, years of it. No one saw him in church, in town, or on the road. A man doesn't come back from a loss like that. So when smoke rose again from the chimney on that ridge, it didn't go unnoticed. A local boy, no older than 9, had been chasing a rabbit through the meadow behind his father's pasture. He'd wandered too far near the edge of Eli's land when he saw movement in the cabin window. A face, a woman's, pale, large, with hair that caught the light like a curtain of fire. She vanished before he could blink, but the boy ran home wide-eyed, breathless, talking over himself. "There's a lady up at the ghost cabin, Mama. I seen her. Big lady. She was looking right at me." The mother didn't say much, just pressed her lips thin and fetched her husband. By nightfall, the news had taken root like bindweed. 2 days later, Reverend Crane rode out on his gelding with a Bible in his coat and a question in his gut. The preacher was tall, lean, and wore his concern like a second skin. But beneath the practiced sympathy was a man who loved knowing more than others. And if Eli Whitlow had taken in a woman, especially that kind of woman, folks had a right to know. Eli saw the preacher coming long before the knock. He always did. He opened the door before the third rap landed, standing in the frame like a fixed cross beam. "Well now," Crane said with a practiced chuckle, "thought I'd come see how you were faring. It's been a long season." Eli stepped aside just enough to make it awkward. "I'm still breathing. Thanks for the concern." The preacher's eyes moved fast, over Eli's shoulder, along the mantel, toward the back room. "Smoke's been steady. he said casually. Folks figured maybe you'd taken in some company. That true? Eli met his gaze flat. Just me. Always been. Crane smiled politely, but it didn't touch his eyes. He stayed for 15 more minutes, sipping weak coffee and asking questions that sounded like prayers. Eli answered them with the same stone-faced quiet he'd worn since the fire. When the preacher left, the only sound was his horse's hooves on packed dirt. Underneath the floorboards, Dinah lay on a bed of blankets, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling. Later that evening, as twilight crept in, Eli lifted the trap door and helped her out. You need to tell me the truth, he said without anger. What is it you're running from? That boy saw you. Words out. Dinah stood upright, shaky, brushing the dust from her dress. Her eyes met his with startling clarity. You think the law protect you? She asked, voice low. You think a star on a chest means justice? Eli didn't answer. They wear stars too, the ones who tied me up, the ones who dragged my sister by her hair and laughed about it. I begged for help. The sheriff looked me dead in the eyes and told me not to stir up trouble. Said women like me bring bad things on ourselves. Eli's hands curled into fists by his sides. I saw something I wasn't meant to see, she continued, and they buried it, deep, but it's not dead. It's still breathing, still waiting, and now they're coming to finish what they started. The fire popped in the hearth. For a moment it sounded like gunfire in the distance. Eli didn't flinch. He believed her, not because she told him to, but because he'd seen that look before, in the mirror the morning after the fire. The look of someone still standing in a house already burned to ash. The days turned slow, as they often did in the hills, where the wind whispered low through the pine and the sun rose like it had no urgency. Dinah moved through Eli's cabin like a shadow turning solid, soft, careful, but real. Her steps, once labored, had found rhythm. She still winced sometimes when she bent or lifted too quickly, but she refused to be idle. Eli hadn't asked her to help. He never would have, but she did, quietly, without fuss. The kind of help that didn't ask permission, only offered kindness. She fed the goats each morning, calling them by names he hadn't given them, names like Tilly and Pinecone and Mercy. The animals responded to her like she was something known, like they'd been waiting for her voice. She sang to them while they chewed, old hymns braided with lullabies, tunes that carried sorrow like a cradle carries a child. The kind of songs only women sing when they have lived too long with silence. Eli watched from the porch some mornings, pretending to whittle when he wasn't. Her body still bore bruises, and her gait carried the memory of chains. But there was something about her, some quiet rootedness. She never asked questions about the past, not his or hers. When she found his wife's dress still hanging, she dusted around it but never touched the fabric. When she saw the portrait of a child left on the shelf, she lit a candle beneath it without a word. Each evening she took out a small leather-bound book, worn at the edges and tied with twine. She would sit by the hearth, pen clutched tight, and write. Eli never asked what she wrote, but one night when the wind was loud and sleep was stubborn, he passed by her chair and glimpsed a single line on the open page. If I disappear again, let someone kind find this. He didn't ask about that either, but the questions began to gnaw. It was early afternoon when it happened. Dinah had been hanging wet linens on the line strung between the cabin and the old sugar pine. Eli had just come back from the south fence and saw her stretching upward, arms raised. The hem of her blouse lifted as the breeze caught it. That's when he saw it, a scar, thick and raised, the color of old rust, burned into the flesh just below her right shoulder blade. Not a whip mark, not a wound from accident or fire. It was a symbol, circular, geometric, intentional. He stopped mid-step, heart sinking into his boots. Dinah must have felt it, his eyes, his stillness. She turned, caught his stare, and froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she lowered her arms slowly, pulling her shirt down with trembling fingers. "Don't ask," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please." Eli opened his mouth, closed it. The brand still burned in his vision, even as she looked away. "There are things," she continued, "that are easier to survive than to explain." She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But her shoulders slumped under the weight of something too heavy for the world to hold. Eli gave a slow nod. "All right." And he meant it. But as he turned back toward the barn, he couldn't stop the chill that crept through his bones. That scar hadn't been made in anger. It had been made in ritual. And whatever kind of people did that, they weren't done yet. The town of Fairvale was no stranger to whispers, but this time they circled sharper, like hawks over a carcass. The name Eli Whitlow, long tucked away with the dust and the dead, was now carried on the wind again, and with it, the mention of a woman. The boy's story had spread like spilled lamp oil. He'd seen someone at the Whitlow place, a large woman, a stranger. And though no one dared knock on Eli's door outright, they didn't have to. The stories grew in every corner of the general store, behind the pews at Sunday service, in the silences between bites at supper. May Crane heard them all, but unlike the rest, she listened differently. The preacher's wife was not one for gossip, but she was a woman who remembered details, especially the ones others forgot. And the name, Dinah, pricked at something old and unfinished in her memory. Years ago, a girl had come through Fairvale, young, heavy-set, shaken to her core. Said she'd run from men who'd locked her up somewhere out in the hills. She'd come to May in the dark, whispering through the back door, asking for herbs for pain and a place to rest. May had taken her in for a single night, then woken the next morning to an empty cot and no trace. No law had been notified, no name had been given. But now, May was almost certain the girl's name had been Dinah. She told Reverend Crane she was going to bring herbs to the Whitlow place, devil's claw and lavender, good for aching joints and nervous tremors. He'd raised a brow but said nothing. He knew better than to question her when her voice held the tone. The ride-up was quiet, the air warm but dry, the land still wearing the dullness of late summer. May had never been to Eli's cabin, not even after the fire. When she stepped down from her mare and knocked at the rough-hewn door, she half expected no answer. But Eli opened the door, slow and steady, eyes cautious. "I come with herbs," May said plainly, "for the nerves and the truth." Eli studied her for a beat before stepping aside. Dinah was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped cup. Her face lifted and froze. For a moment, May thought she might scream. Instead, Dinah crumpled into tears, the sound raw and sudden, like something old breaking open. May crossed the room and held her without asking. It wasn't until Dinah whispered, "You tried to help me," that Eli realized they knew each other. May stayed only an hour. She left a bundle of herbs on the counter and a quiet warning by the door. "She's been touched by something wicked, Eli," she said, her voice low. "And I don't mean superstition. That mark on her back. Men don't do that unless they believe they're gods. And there's men in this county who think just that. Landowners, lawmen, men who never answer to anyone." Eli didn't reply, but May could see it in his face. He knew she was right. As she mounted her horse, she looked back once more at the cabin, the smoke from the chimney, the boarded windows, the woman inside trying to stitch her soul back together. Then she rode off into the dying light, her heart heavy with the truth that some men don't just own land. They try to own the living too. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple by the time Dinah finally spoke. She stood by the goat pen, arms folded over the fence rail, her eyes fixed on the slow movement of the animals settling for the night. Eli leaned against the cabin wall, chewing on a sliver of pine wood, watching her in the kind of silence that left room for truth. She didn't look at him when she said it. "There's a place up north called Juniper Hollow." The words floated out like smoke from a long-dead fire. Eli narrowed his eyes. "A mining town?" She shook her head. "Not on any map you've seen. Hidden deep past the ridgeline, behind the pine wall where the roads don't run. No post, no law, just God, or at least that's what they claimed." Eli didn't interrupt. Her voice was steady now, but thin, like a rope stretched too tight. "They called it a sanctuary, said they took in women that the world threw out, orphans, widows, whores, the unwanted. But that was the lie. What they really built was a market. Girls trained to be obedient. Fat ones like me were fed more. Told our size made us holy. Said we were made in the image of patience, of endurance." Eli's jaw flexed. Dinah blinked, slow. "When I was 14, they put me in the quiet house. That meant I was ready. That's where they broke us. Took our names. Gave us new ones. Mine was Ruth." She spit the name like it burned her mouth. "That's where I saw it." She paused, her knuckles white on the fence. "She was tied up, naked, praying, crying. They called it correction. Said she spoke out when she wasn't spoken to. They left her tied to a fence on the outer trail. Left her there in the sun for 3 days. On the third morning, I walked past to bring water to the goats and she was still alive. She looked me right in the eyes and whispered, 'Don't let them tie you next.'" Eli felt his stomach turn. "I ran that night, hid in dry riverbeds, barns, beneath wagons. I didn't stop until I found Fairvale. But I was too slow, too noticeable. They caught me once, branded me, marked me as theirs. I got away again, but I know they followed. Maybe not right behind, but I can feel it, like something crawling just beneath the surface. They'll want me back, Eli, or buried." The last light faded from the sky. For a long while, he didn't say anything. Then his voice cracked low and tired. "My wife died bringing our daughter into this world. I was drunk that night, couldn't stop pacing. Blame the doctor, blame the pain, blame the world. I lit a fire in the stove too high, too fast, went outside to cool off, bottle in hand, and the chimney caught. By the time I got back, the smoke had swallowed the walls." Dinah turned slowly, her eyes full of something deeper than sorrow. "I buried them both behind the cabin," he finished. "Then I buried myself in the years that followed." They stood in silence, 2 lives shaped by loss, carved hollow by fire and fear. And for the first time, the air between them felt less like a wound and more like a bridge. The ghosts were still there, of Juniper Hollow, of the burned cabin, but now they had names, and now they had each other. The next morning, the wind blew with a different edge, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something raw. Eli stood at the base of the cabin porch with his eyes on the tree line, jaw set tight. He hadn't slept. His hands were already smeared with dirt and sweat. The earth freshly packed over a shallow pit beside the front path, hidden beneath fallen needles. The trigger wire he'd strung across it was taut and invisible unless you knew where to look. He was preparing for war. Dinah watched him from the window, her hands pressed together like in prayer, but her face carved with certainty. This wasn't fear, it was memory. By noon, Eli had wired 3 traps through the upper pasture, laid glass shards beneath the porch step, and boarded the cellar doors from the inside. He worked methodically, saying little, but his movements spoke louder than words. The man who had once buried himself in silence was now listening to every rustle, every broken twig, every shift of the birds overhead. Inside, Dinah cleared the kitchen table and laid out a length of old rope. "I need to show you something," she said. Eli stepped in, wiping his brow with a sleeve. She sat, pulled the rope toward her, and began to tie. Her fingers worked slowly, deliberately. She looped once, then again, then wove the strand through a complex spiraled turn that looked more like a symbol than a restraint. "This is the knot they used when they meant to punish," she said. "Not just tie up, to display. The elders called it the servant's cross." Eli stared at it. "Never seen a knot like that." "You wouldn't," she replied. "They taught it only to women once we passed the cleansing. Tying it wrong was another sin. That's how they controlled us. Not just with fear, with ritual, with meaning." He picked it up, ran his fingers over the woven loop, and felt the chill crawl into his chest. This wasn't something a drifter would know. This wasn't something made up. A knock came at dusk, soft but urgent. Eli swung the door open with his rifle raised. It was May. "I figured I'd find you coiled up like a rattler," she said, stepping past him. She held a basket in one hand, a folded note in the other. "What's that?" Dinah asked, rising from her seat. May handed her the paper. "It's from a friend who works records in Dry Creek. I asked him to check court dockets, prison logs, anything with the name Juniper Hollow." She waited a beat, then added, "Sheriff Long's name shows up more than once. Payments, transfers, nothing official, nothing he couldn't claim was by the book. But it ain't clean." Eli looked at her, and something behind his ribs stirred, hot, dangerous, and long dormant. "We can't count on the law," May said plainly. "Not this law." Eli nodded once. Then he walked to the shelf by the hearth and pulled down a long-forgotten rifle case. Dust puffed into the air as he cracked it open. Inside lay the Winchester he hadn't touched since the fire. He set it on the table. The weight of it felt right in his hands, like it had been waiting. "Guess it's time I start acting like a man again," he said. Dinah met his eyes. "You already are." Outside, the wind pressed harder against the shutters, but inside the cabin, the air had changed. It no longer smelled of grief. It smelled of resolve. The stranger rode into Fairvale just after midday, his coat pressed sharp at the seams and boots too clean for trail dust. He looked the part of a cattleman, hat low, spurs quiet, silver belt buckle gleaming. But there was something too deliberate in the way he moved. Like every step was chosen, every glance rehearsed. He tied his horse near the post office, offered a nod to the blacksmith, then walked straight into the saloon without asking directions. Inside, the room quieted with the kind of hush reserved for men who don't quite belong. He ordered nothing. Instead, he leaned one elbow against the bar and asked plainly, "Anyone seen a man named Eli Whitlow?" No one answered at first. Then Lyle Harper, the stable boy, spoke up, too young to know better. "Old Whitlow? Man don't come down no more. Why you asking?" The stranger smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "He's kin. Got word he's been keeping company with a woman gone missing. Big girl. Goes by Dinah." That name landed heavy. The barkeep shifted. A woman near the window stood to leave. The stranger didn't follow with more words. He just watched, his eyes scanning each face like he was measuring what kind of lie they'd tell next. On his belt, just off to the side of the silver buckle, was a leather patch burned with a strange circular emblem. Simple, elegant, and wrong. May Crane, just arriving with a satchel of linens from the dry goods store, caught sight of him as he stepped out of the saloon. Her breath hitched. She didn't know his name, but she knew the brand, the same symbol she'd seen scarred into Dinah's back. She turned her horse without hesitation and rode hard toward the ridge. By dusk, Eli had heard every word she could remember. He didn't interrupt, just stood there by the fire with his jaw clenched and his hand resting on the Winchester. Dinah sat in the corner, her face pale but set. "Did he ask my name?" she asked May. "He did," May replied. "Said he was your brother." Dinah scoffed. "I don't have a brother." Eli moved to the door and checked the traps, the rifle never leaving his side. That night, long after the house had gone still, a single shot cracked through the darkness. The bullet shattered the front window and buried itself in the wall above the hearth. Eli rolled out of bed in one motion, rifle drawn, eyes already on the tree line. But whoever had pulled the trigger was already gone, swallowed by the dark. In the morning, Dinah took a scrap of cedar from the woodpile and began carving. Her hands moved slow, deliberate, tracing the emblem she'd seen burned into her own skin and on that man's belt. "This needs to be seen," she said softly. "They hide behind silence and ceremony. But this symbol, it's the only thing they're proud enough to leave behind." Eli watched her as the lines took shape, curved, symmetrical, almost beautiful. A false beauty, like poison wrapped in ribbon. "They think they can mark people like cattle," she said, her voice tightening. "Let's make sure they can't hide anymore." Outside, the wind carried dust and secrets down from the ridge, but the cabin stood its ground. The symbol was nearly finished, and the fight was coming closer. The barn smelled of dust and old smoke, the kind that never fully left, no matter how many seasons passed. Eli stood in the center of it, lantern in hand, casting a dull glow across the rafters. The boards creaked beneath his boots, as though the wood remembered the night the fire had tried to swallow it whole. Dinah stood beside him, silent but present, the carved emblem from the night before wrapped in cloth and tucked into her coat pocket. She didn't speak, only followed him as he walked to the far corner, to a spot untouched by tools or time. There, beneath an old feed rack in a pile of mold-warped canvas, lay the trap door. Eli knelt without a word and pulled it open. Dust rose like a ghost between them. Beneath the boards was a cedar chest, blackened at the corners from smoke, but still whole. He hesitated before lifting it out. His hands trembled, not from effort, but from memory. "I ain't touched this since the week after," he said quietly. Dinah waited. He undid the iron latch and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in linen and ash, were the remnants of a life interrupted. A pair of baby shoes, too small for walking, one toe curled inward from heat, a lock of golden hair tied with ribbon nestled in a wooden keepsake box, a stuffed rabbit missing one eye, and at the bottom, folded with care, a letter with singed edges, written in a hand Eli hadn't seen in almost a decade. He picked it up, slow, unfolded it, read it in silence, his lips moving slightly but his voice gone. After a long time, he handed it to Dinah. She read it aloud, her voice trembling. "Eli, if this finds you after I've gone, I beg you, don't carry this alone. Don't let the fire inside you burn everything around it. We all break, but that's not a reason to stop loving. Forgive yourself, raise her gently, and if not her, then someone. Someone kind, someone in need. That's how you'll find your way back." Dinah's voice broke at the last line. Eli sat down hard on an overturned crate, staring at the chest. "I was drunk," he muttered, "mad at the doctor for leaving, mad at the pain she was in, mad that I couldn't fix it. I lit the stove too hot, tried to clear my head outside, and when I turned back, the roof was already lit up like hell come calling." Dinah knelt beside him, one hand on the edge of the cedar chest. "I ain't a good man," he whispered. "Good men don't let their family burn. Good men don't disappear into the woods and let the world rot." She reached out and gently took his hand, her fingers warm and strong, despite the ache in her bones. "You didn't leave me tied to that fence," she said, steady as stone. "That's what makes you good." He didn't cry, not quite, but something shifted behind his eyes, something uncoiled. The barn was silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of loss. It was the quiet of something healing, slow but certain, like roots returning to scorched earth. They closed the chest together, not to bury it again, but to make room for what came next. The stars were sharp overhead when Eli mounted his horse and rode toward town, the hooves muffled by the dirt path and the weight of what he carried. He didn't want to be seen. The moon did him no favors, rising high and white like a watchful eye. But he kept on, wind in his coat, rifle slung across his back, and Dinah's words heavy in his ears. Fairvale was asleep when he arrived, shutters drawn and lanterns out. He tied his horse behind the church and made his way on foot to the back stoop of the preacher's house. May answered his knock almost before it landed, like she'd been waiting. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamplight low. He told her everything, about Juniper Hollow, about the scar, the rituals, the emblem, the voice of a woman left to die on a fence. He didn't soften the edges. Dinah's story wasn't the kind that asked for comfort. May listened with her hands folded, jaw set tight. When he finished, she stood and crossed the room, opened a drawer and pulled out a small ledger. She thumbed through it, stopped at a page and slid it across the table. "These are the families," she said. "The ones who came to me after losing someone. Some gone years ago, some just vanished last season. Always the same kind of note left behind. Runaway, bad blood, not fit for town life." Eli read the names slowly. Some he knew, some he didn't. But every name felt heavier now. They gathered 6 others in the preacher's barn before the rooster crowed. All folks May trusted. A widower with a sunken face. A woman who hadn't smiled since her sister disappeared in spring. A mother whose daughter's shoes were still on the porch. Some listened in disbelief. Others nodded before he even finished speaking. One man scoffed. "So a fat girl with a scar shows up, spins a wild story, and suddenly we're talking secret cults and buried towns?" Eli didn't rise to it. May did. "She ain't just a fat girl," May said, voice like a hammer. "She's a survivor. She's carrying proof. And you all judged Eli once, burned his name into ash. You gonna do it again? Or you gonna listen this time?" Silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was shifting. By dawn, they had a plan. Quiet watching, asking questions. No law involved yet, not until they had more. But the fire came first. Just before noon, smoke rolled over the town square, thick and black. The barn behind the mercantile was ablaze. Townsfolk ran with buckets and cries, but the roof collapsed before a drop touched the flames. When it cooled, the sheriff and 2 deputies poked through the wreckage. It wasn't the fire that rattled them. It was what had been carved into the largest beam, still half standing, half charred. The words were crude but clear. "The knot must not be untied." It spread through town like sickness. Women clutched their children tighter. Men kept hands near their belts. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something had come to Fairvale. Something buried was clawing its way to the surface. And the question wasn't if the town would believe. It was whether they'd stand before it or burn. The U.S. Marshal arrived 2 days after the fire, wearing dust from 3 counties and a badge that hadn't yet been dulled by compromise. He was younger than the townsfolk expected, early 30s, lean, eyes clear, but already shadowed by the weight of roads ridden alone. His name was Marshal Rowan Hale, and when he dismounted in front of the Fairvale Chapel, every head turned. May Crane met him first, arms crossed, her face lined but resolute. She'd sent the letter weeks ago, not knowing if anyone would read it, let alone answer. But here he was, proof that some wires still hummed with justice. Hale wasted no time. He interviewed the preacher, the barkeep, the stable boy, the merchant's wife. He asked about the fire, the warning carved into the barn, and the stranger who came asking for a fat woman named Dinah. He listened more than he spoke, a habit that unsettled men used to hearing their own voices first. By the time he knocked on Eli's door, the sun was hanging low, and the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the restlessness of a town on edge. Eli opened the door, rifle in hand. Not raised, but not slung either. "Marshal Hale," the young man said with a nod. "Heard you might be expecting me." Eli stepped aside without a word. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Eli had once listened to Dinah's truth by lantern light. Now it was his turn. He spoke slow, steady, not dressing anything up. He told Hale about Dinah, about Juniper Hollow, about the fence post and the knot, about the ritual scar and the man with the polished boots and empty eyes. The marshal didn't flinch, but his silence grew heavier. "You expecting me to believe there's a secret order breeding women like livestock?" he asked finally. "I expect you to look at what she's got," Eli said. He called for Dinah, and she came into the room with quiet steps, her face calm, her eyes fierce. Without a word, she pulled down the collar of her blouse and turned slightly to reveal the mark burned into her back. Hale leaned forward. The symbol wasn't crude. It was precise, too deliberate to be accident, too intimate to be meaningless. She set a small, folded paper on the table. He opened it carefully. The ink was faded but legible. A list of names. Columns marked purity, weight, price, and delivery. At the bottom, Sheriff Langley, verified $300. Marshal Hale's jaw clenched. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "Stole it," Dinah said. "From a locked drawer. Before I ran." He stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it once and slipped it into his coat. "All right," he said. "I believe you." Eli didn't breathe until he heard those words. "We're going to need more than a ledger," Hale added. "We're going to need names, witnesses, and a hell of a lot of courage." Eli met his eyes. "You'll have it." That night they made a plan, not for vengeance, for truth. They would expose the order, burn its roots with the light of what had been hidden too long. And when they did, every man with blood on his hands would learn the same thing. That justice, when it comes late, comes hard. The church bell rang just past noon, though no sermon was planned. Its clang echoed across Fairvale like a thunderclap, summoning folks with a weight that wasn't Sunday in spirit, but judgment in purpose. One by one they arrived, mothers with their children, ranch hands with dirt still under their nails, widows, merchants, and skeptics. The pews filled with the uneasy murmurs of a town on the edge of reckoning. At the pulpit stood May Crane, her back straight and hands steady despite the storm she knew was about to break. Beside her, Marshal Hale stood in uniform, the ledger tucked beneath his arm. Dinah sat in the front row, hands clenched in her lap, her body unmoving but her breath short and fast. Eli stood just behind her, tall and silent as a pine tree, rifle slung across his back. Not a threat, but a promise. May raised her voice first. "Fairvale," she said, "you've heard the whispers. You've seen the smoke, but today you'll see the truth." She turned to the marshal and stepped aside. Hale laid the ledger on the altar like a sacred book. "This document was stolen from a place north of here, a place not on any map, a place called Juniper Hollow." He paused, letting the name settle. "What it contains is a record, not of debt, not of land, but of women, of trades, of sales. And in it, you will find the name of your own sheriff." A gasp rippled through the room. Sheriff Langley, seated near the back, stood with his jaw tight. "Now wait just a damn minute." "You'll get your time," Hale cut him off, voice calm but firm. "But first, she gets hers." He gestured to Dinah. She rose slowly, her steps uneven, her frame trembling beneath the weight of every eye in the room. But when she reached the pulpit and turned to face the crowd, something steadied in her spine. "My name is Dinah," she began, voice thin but clear. "I was born into a place that called itself holy, but it was hell. They raised us to serve, to be sold. They burned us if we disobeyed. And when I ran, they sent men like him," she pointed to the sheriff, "to bring us back or burn us quiet." Langley's face reddened. She's lying. She's a lunatic. You can't trust. She bears the brand, May said loudly, cutting him off. And we have more than her word. An old man stood from the back, his weathered hands shaking. Caleb Hargrove, one of the oldest ranchers in the county. His voice cracked as he spoke. My daughter Mary disappeared 10 years ago, he said. Said she wanted to find faith, find purpose. The last I saw her, she was following men in black coats. Said they were from Juniper Hollow. I never saw her again. The room turned cold. Langley made for the door, but Eli was already moving. He stepped into the sheriff's path, unshouldering his rifle with slow intent. You don't get to run. Two deputies flinched, unsure, until Hale pulled his badge and said, He's under arrest. Langley tried to protest, but no one listened. Hands once silent now reached for him. Townsfolk who had whispered too long, who had doubted too easily. He was dragged to the front, cuffed with iron, and left to sit on the church steps like a broken idol. Inside, Dinah exhaled for the first time in hours. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled. Not with fear, but release. Eli watched her from the aisle, his jaw soft, his eyes warm. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. She had stood. She had spoken. And the fire had finally started to burn in the right direction. The morning they rode out, the sky was pale and brittle, like a sheet of tin hammered flat. The marshal led the way, his badge glinting as he sat tall in the saddle. Beside him, Eli rode silent, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Behind them followed a small, grim posse, men and women who had lost daughters, sisters, wives. They carried rifles and axes, but what weighed heavier was the anger they'd kept buried for years. The air smelled of frost and pine pitch, and every hoofbeat on the hard ground echoed like a drumbeat toward judgment. They rode for hours without speaking, climbing deeper into the ridge where the trails thinned and the trees grew thick enough to swallow the light. Dinah had told them how to find it, a split boulder shaped like a wolf's head, a narrow cut through the spruce, and then a hidden path veering left where no path should be. By noon they reached it. Juniper Hollow lay ahead like a secret whispered too many times. Low cabins, whitewashed walls, and a crooked steeple that seemed to lean under its own guilt. The place was quiet, too quiet. No women moved between the buildings. No smoke rose from the chimneys. Only the sound of a distant creek and the nervous snorts of their horses. Marshal Hale raised a hand and dismounted. Keep your eyes open, he said. Eli's boots hit the ground with a thud. He checked the Winchester, thumbed back the hammer, his heartbeat steady, not with panic, but with something colder, older. The closer he stepped, the more he felt the weight of Dinah's voice. They left her tied to a fence. They left me for next. They moved through the hollow in a slow, deliberate sweep, opening doors, peering into shadows. Inside the cabins, they found scraps of life abandoned, Bibles with missing pages, ropes coiled like snakes, and children's shoes scattered on the floors. No children, no women, just emptiness and the smell of something rotting beneath the clean. It was in the chapel that Eli found him. A man stood at the altar, sleeves rolled up, hands wet from scrubbing blood-dark stains off the floorboards. He looked up, startled but not afraid. His face was narrow, eyes pale, hair combed slick with oil. The same cold precision as the stranger who'd come to Fairvale. The same emptiness in his gaze. Eli stepped forward. You tied her to the fence. The man tilted his head. You'll have to be more specific. We've tied many. Punishment brings purity. Eli's grip tightened on the rifle. Dinah! The man shrugged like the name meant nothing. Ah, that one. She should have been grateful. A heavy body carries heavier sin. He didn't get to finish the next word. The shot cracked through the chapel like thunder. The man's body jerked backward and crumpled against the altar, a dark stain spreading beneath him. No sermon, no prayer, just an end. No one spoke. The posse began moving without orders, pulling ropes from the walls, dragging benches outside. One man splashed kerosene, another struck a match. The steeple caught first, flames curling upward like the ghosts of every woman buried here. Eli stood in the doorway and watched as Juniper Hollow burned. The fire roared into the sky, a pyre for the forgotten. The wind carried ash into his hair and stung his eyes, but he didn't look away. He thought of Dinah, of her voice when she spoke of this place, of her scar, of her trembling hands. And for the first time in years, he felt something break free inside him. Not rage, not grief, but a grim kind of peace. Behind him, the marshal said, "It's done." Eli lowered his rifle and turned from the flames. "No," he said quietly, "it's only started." The smoke from Juniper Hollow had long since vanished into the sky, but its ashes lingered in the air of Fairvale like the closing of a long, dark chapter. The fear that once gripped the town had loosened its hold, and in the quiet that followed, something unfamiliar began to grow, something close to hope. Dinah stepped out of May Crane's home each morning with a satchel of herbs and a list of women to visit. She moved slowly still, careful with her knees, but her hands were steady now, and her voice had taken on the calm weight of someone who had learned to speak not just with words, but with presence. The townsfolk began to notice. May watched with a quiet smile as Dinah measured tinctures, wrapped herbs in cheesecloth, and brewed teas for aching joints and sleepless nights. Some came just to speak with her, widows, expectant mothers, and even girls who'd once averted their eyes when she passed. They now sat at her feet and listened as she explained how to tell valerian root from feverfew. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her kindness worked like water in dry soil. Meanwhile, Eli could be seen most days with a hammer in hand, crouched over the splintered church steps or hauling beams to replace the old barn timbers scorched in the fire. He spoke little, but when children passed, he'd tip his hat, and when someone offered him a drink, he didn't wave them off like he once would have. One afternoon, a boy with freckles and a crooked hat approached him in the square, holding something wrapped in a towel. "Mama baked this," he said, thrusting the bundle forward. "Said thank you for protecting the big lady." Eli blinked, surprised, then took the warm bundle in both hands. The boy ran off before he could find words. He unwrapped it to find a still warm berry pie, lopsided but fragrant. He stood there a long time, watching the boy disappear into the crowd, then carried the pie to May's stoop. When Dinah saw it, she laughed, full and unguarded. "The big lady, huh?" Eli smirked. "Could be worse. Could be true," she said, grinning, and sliced into it. That evening they sat on the porch together, sharing the pie straight from the tin, forks clinking gently. The sky overhead was painted in streaks of rose and gold, and for once there was no urgency in the fading light. No threat waiting at the edge of the woods, just the sound of goats settling in the barn and a town exhaling. Down the lane someone was repairing their fence. Across the square, a girl practiced the piano through an open window. For the first time in too long, Fairvale felt like a place where new things could take root. The fire hadn't just burned the hollow, it had cleared the ground. And in that space, something tender and resilient had begun to grow. Tended by steady hands, shared work, and the quiet strength of those who had suffered and chosen, against all odds, to stay. The meeting was called at sundown in the town hall, a squat building of rough beams and crooked windows that had seen more arguments than resolutions. The benches filled early, farmers with sun-creased brows, mothers with babes on their hips, young men curious, old men wary. The room buzzed with unease, not because of what was being proposed, but because of who was proposing it. May Crane stood at the front, her hands folded in front of her, calm as always, voice firm. "Fairvale needs a schoolhouse," she said. "Not next year, not someday, now." There were nods. murmurs of agreement. But when she added, "And we ought to build it on the land that used to belong to Sheriff Langley," a ripple went through the room like a gust of wind snapping a line. One man stood. "That land's cursed," he said, "tainted by what happened." "No," May replied. "It's hollowed out, and hollow ground can still grow good things. If we let it." Whispers carried. A few nodded again. Then she turned to the final piece. "And I want Dinah to be the teacher." A pause. Heavier now. People shifting. Eyes glancing around, unsure who'd speak first. "Dinah?" A woman said from the back, hesitant. "She's not trained. Ain't she just helping with babies?" May's tone never wavered. "She can read. She can write. She's kind, steady, and knows how to turn pain into something useful. That's more education than most of us ever got." Someone else cleared their throat. "She's big, and she ain't from here." May's gaze swept the room. "She bled on our land, was nearly left to die on it, and instead of turning bitter, she's healing it. If you can't see the strength in that, then maybe you're not ready for a schoolhouse at all." There was silence, then a soft voice from the middle row. "I lost my daughter to the men Langley worked for," said Caleb Hargrove. "Dinah's the reason I even know the truth. I'd trust her to teach any child of mine." All heads turned when Dinah herself stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I was taught to be obedient," she said. "Taught that knowledge was dangerous, that curiosity was sin, that women should never ask questions. I believed it until it nearly killed me. Then I learned the truth." She looked around the room, at the hard faces, the hopeful ones, the frightened ones. "A schoolhouse means giving our children the right to wonder, to read, to speak up, to grow. If we build it on cursed ground, then let it curse the silence, not the future." A long breath passed through the crowd, like the room had exhaled something old and sour. Marshall Hale stood near the wall and said, "I'll donate the first books." Eli moved from the doorway, took his place beside Dinah without saying a word. His presence spoke louder than anything he could have offered. The vote was called. One by one, hands rose. The schoolhouse would be built. On land once claimed by a man who tried to bury truth, they would raise a place where truth could grow. And at the center of it stood Dinah, once tied to a fence like an animal, now chosen to guide the minds of the next generation. By the time the frost thawed and the first green shoots dared to rise through the Fairvale soil, the schoolhouse stood tall, clean, and full of light. It was a modest building made of fresh-hewn pine and painted by volunteer hands. But to the townsfolk, it shone like something sacred. Its door was left open most days, even before the bell rang, and it wasn't long before children began arriving early, sometimes just to sit quietly, to listen to the birds' song, or to help Dinah sweep the porch. Inside, Dinah moved with purpose. Her days were measured not by clocks, but by stories. She taught with the rhythm of someone who had once been denied every word she now gave freely. Reading came first. She made sure every child could look at a page and not feel afraid. Then came writing, arithmetic, and always, always storytelling. She shared tales from far-off lands and invented ones of her own, laced with truth and wonder, parables in the old tradition. The children adored her. They whispered to one another about how she could make you feel braver just by looking your way. She was firm, yes. There were rules and she made them stick. But kindness laced everything she did. She taught the loud boys how to listen and the quiet girls how to speak. No one was too small, too wild, or too poor. Every child had a place. They called her Miss Dinah until one day, a small girl with freckles and a crooked braid stayed behind after class. She stood by the desk, hands clasped, a question lodged in her throat. "What's your real name?" she asked. "I mean, the one you want?" Dinah paused. her hands stilled over a stack of slates. She looked out the window at the field beyond, where the cottonwood tree swayed in the breeze, its limbs stretched wide like open arms. She turned back with a soft smile. "You can call me Miss Hope." The girl grinned, nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world, and skipped out into the sun. That evening, Eli walked down to the schoolyard. He carried planks of cedar and a whittling knife. He set to work beneath the cottonwood tree where the children liked to gather, carving slowly, letting the wood guide his hands. By the time the moon had risen, the bench stood solid beneath the boughs, and across its back was a single word, carved deep and smooth: hope. In the weeks that followed, it became the most visited spot in town. Folks sat there after market days. Children read books with bare feet swinging above the grass. Mothers came just to rest a while and breathe. The wind carried her name now, not the old one, not the one scarred onto her back, but the one she chose. It moved through Fairvale like a hymn, soft and certain, rising from the schoolhouse, from the porch of May's home, from Eli's steady hands. And for the first time in many long years, the town didn't just heal, it remembered how to feel warm. The wind moved softly that morning, rustling through the tall grass, with the hush of something sacred. The sun was warm but gentle, and the hills that once stood as silent witnesses to sorrow now stretched wide and golden, alive with wildflowers and the hum of bees. Eli and Dinah walked side by side along the far edge of his land, their steps slow, unhurried. There was no need to rush. The fence was gone. Where once weathered posts stood, bearing the weight of cruel rope and silence, now there was nothing but open field. In its place bloomed bluebells and golden yarrow, prairie clover, and milkweed swaying like a quiet choir. The place where Dinah had been tied, where her cries had been swallowed by wind and sun, was no longer marked by pain, but by growth. She stopped at one of the old posts Eli had left standing, half-rotted, reclaimed by earth. From her pocket she pulled a ribbon, faded lavender, frayed at the edges. She didn't tie it tight. She looped it once, loose and light, and let the breeze play with its tail. Eli stood a few paces back, watching her. He tipped his hat, squinting toward the horizon. "Why leave it?" he asked quietly. "That ribbon, why not just let it all go?" She turned, her face calm, steady. "I did let it go," she said. "This ain't to remember the pain. It's to remember I lived." He nodded once, words caught somewhere in his chest. They stood together, facing the fields. In the distance, the town of Fairvale shimmered in the late morning sun, children running between buildings, the bell of the schoolhouse ringing clear, smoke curling from chimneys, not in warning, but in welcome. Eli looked at her, his voice rough as old bark. "What do you want now, Dinah?" She smiled, not the small, cautious smile she used to wear, but the real one, full and sure, soft at the edges and rooted in something deep. "Peace," she said, "and a garden." He chuckled low, the sound like gravel stirred by spring rain. "Think I can manage that?" They turned back toward the cabin, their footsteps slow, matching the rhythm of the land around them. There was no need for fences anymore. What needed protecting now wasn't a boundary, but a beginning. And as the camera rises, as the cottonwoods sway and the fields stretch wide, the voice of the narrator returns, clear and warm. There are places the world tries to bury, names it tries to erase, wounds it calls too deep to heal, but stories like seeds don't stay buried forever. And when the right hands reach down, when the right hearts take hold, what once was bound can be made free. Because there is no weight too great, no wound too deep, when hearts choose to untie what others have bound. And the wind, carrying the scent of wildflowers and cedar smoke, whispers one name, soft but unbroken. Hope.